Hello everybody, I'm your host, Dr. Darkspawn, and welcome. Welcome to the definitive Dreadshore guide where I will be running you through everything you need to know about everything that was released during the Dreadshore sector. With the release of the new sector, I thought it prudent to perhaps make a little bit of a guide so that you can get all the info you need about all the traps that was released in the previous sector, what they do, how they do it, and how well they do it. Right, with that being said, let's first hop into the cosmetic part of the Dreadshore update. Right, now with the release of the Dreadshore update, we have gotten two new blocks. One metal block that you can see on the back left, and a wooden block with metal reinforcings on the back right. We've had three new props, as you can see here, and 8 decals to color and choose from, not including the ranked decals. Starting with the metal blocks, we can see a lot of thick piping going over the top and the bottom of two of the sides, and thick reinforcements running along them with lots of rivets inside. Now, these blocks do repeat on every opposite side, as you can see here. If I rotate it twice, it's the same block, and the top and the bottom are these little sheets that are placed. The left and the right are the reinforced triangle shapes, and the piping is on the bits in between. Moving on to the wooden blocks, we can see 3 sides that also repeat, but not opposite ends like the metal block. Some of them are directly next to each other, like these two clear open parts in the wood that are just, pieces of wood on the top of it. And the only difference really between them would be the layout of the moss that grows along the edges of this block. Now, there's also some reinforcing and some minor wiring on the bottom of them, but nothing really too spectacular. Very atmospheric though. For the props, we have a double light. On this end, we have a sort of an iron lung pressure system going on that presumably works with steam and regulates that. It's got quite an atmospheric noise to it, especially when you're listening to it in the rain of the new Dreadshore map type. And we have some metal bars that you can use to create the bottom of pillars quite effectively, and look pretty good on a lighter colored block. Doesn't matter on which side. There could be the reinforcements on the side of a pillar or on the bottom to help make it look a little bit more factory-esque. The colors and the decals that we got, some of them were introduced in the mid-sector update along with the DLC and skins for the Nautilus suit and the Demolition cannon. We have blue, we have green, we've got weird green moss, we have brown smearings, and we have a nice blue and white tile set that works great with creating some optical illusions, especially this one over here. If you use it on an upwards going slant, it makes it look like you're running through a straight corridor, even though you're actually walking up an incline. And another even darker full block pattern smear. Well, there again, that does it for the cosmetic side of things. Let's head on to the traps and the guard. Moving on to the Sentry beam, we can see that it has a 5 3/4 block direct straight line range that it can detect and fire at players, though the beam itself goes much farther than 5 blocks. It technically goes up until the edge of the map and then disappears. You have a 4 block length at about 50 to 60 degree angle extending upwards, creating a cone, and towards the bottom as well. 4 blocks. If you take the outer edge of this ramp block and you kind of pull this ramp without bending it towards the bottom here, you'll see that it kind of ends on exactly that point. So we'll say it's 4 blocks long towards the top and the bottom, and towards the sides it is the exact same length. With that being said, we can now say that this is a 4-block long cone that extends in every direction. And once you reach the 4-block mark, you'll see that it's denoted by this line. It has a half moon oval shape, kind of like the human eye, in which if you take the distance from the sentry beam to the end, where this cone also extends for about 2.5 blocks, and the 45-degree angle from the beam itself towards the 2 corrosives that I placed here would make that 5 blocks of distance away. So this would be roughly 5 3/4 blocks away, this would be 5 blocks away, and this would be 4 blocks away on the point where the 4-block length cone finishes. So about 4 blocks, 5 blocks, and 5 3/4 blocks of length in the sentry beam. So it's got quite a good bit of range, and it's towards any direction. And with the range of the sentry beam extending into every direction, it becomes very, very deadly, and means that it can be used in many different situations, even more considering that its beams can deflect off of surfaces and fill an entire room with persistent laser beams that kill on contact. Moving on to the Ravager here, I have placed and pathed the Ravager to walk onto the very edge of this block. I have placed this red block here for me to stand and test the range on. This block is 8 blocks of distance away from the Ravager and should effectively be the maximum range that the Ravager can shoot base without the optic mod. And there's something really interesting with it, even if you do give it optics. So let me show you that. Once the Ravager activates, it will shoot a little past its... Once the Ravager activates, it will shoot even though its bolts disappear at about the 8-block mark. And if you do give it optics, it does not extend the range at which these bolts persist. It has a very slight upwards arc, much like the Enforcer, but unlike the Enforcer, it shoots a 6-pellet shotgun blast of bolts, which are all parryable in one motion as well, the same as with an Enforcer bolt, effectively making it just as useful as an Enforcer, only that sometimes some of these bolts can hit like the edge of a corner block like this, and 1 or 2 of them will pass through. Not that they will persist past 8 blocks regardless, but it does mean that the Ravager has very limited use. Now, with the Ravager shot ending at about 7 3/4 of a block, because it's not standing directly on the edge, as you can see that it has moved back a tiny bit. Its tracking is pretty good, its fire rate is pretty good. I do believe its fire rate is actually quite a bit faster than the Enforcer, but unfortunately the fact that its bolt does not go past the 8-block range of distance from it is rather disappointing. It also has a much bigger hitbox for its head and for its legs than the Enforcer. As you can see here, it's very easy to hit the head, it's very easy to hit the legs, since they are so massive in comparison to the rest of the body, which the Enforcer does not have, that it's also rather easy to kill and counter. Now, there is no optics mod for the Sentry beam, but there is an optics mod that can be given for the Ravager. With optics, the Ravager shoots at about 10.5 blocks of distance. However, unfortunately, the bolts do not persist past 8 blocks in range, and as you can see, even though it has a higher arc, because the bolts need to reach further and it needs to generate that arc to fire on me, which is now standing further away than I was before, the bolts do not reach. So I do not recommend putting optical implant on your Ravager unless you want them to perhaps destroy traps that are on your roof, or shoot consistently like this and irritate the person that's raiding your outpost. Right, and that should cover the range and range mods for both the guard and the trap that was released. Let's hop on to the more interesting mods then. shall we? Right, now for the Ravager, looking at its base fire rate before we put on the fire rate mod, we can see that from activation towards firing is about 1.5 seconds, and the time from the animation startup to fire is about 2 seconds. Now, as we can see here, adding the fire rate mod onto the Ravager on the right does not decrease the amount of time that they scream once they get aggroed, effectively making it still 1.5 seconds. But in terms of fire rate, the fire rate is greatly increased and far more deadly. So timing the one on the right from its fire rate animation to the end does take about 1.3 seconds, a significant reduction of about 0.6 seconds in between shots. And the more shots you have that are firing, the more it catches up, and would eventually mean that you get 2 or 3 or 4 free shots out of the same Ravager for quite a small price at only 20 capacity. Now, the Deadman switch and the short leash mod function exactly the same as they do on an Enforcer. The explosive radius is the same, and the 1.5 blocks value on short leash is also the same. Looking at the armor on a Ravager, we can see that it has no left arm, same as the Enforcer, and its arm is far larger and way more exposed than the Enforcer, though, with its legs also being as massive as mentioned before. The armor does go up higher towards the head, protecting the head a little bit better than it does the Enforcer, and put down one for scale. The legs on the Enforcer do appear a little bit smaller, at least they're not protruding as much towards the front and are as open with the orange pants, as we can see. So they actually do look a little bit smaller, not by much, just a tiny bit. And with them being a little bit further backwards rather than protruding forward heavily like the Ravager, they are much more difficult to snap onto, especially if you're looking down really quick. The armor otherwise looking much the same, except on the one shoulder arm here, on the arm that has the cannon, to which it is far more armored. And I do believe there is an extra plate here that was moved forward from the back of the Enforcer shoulder. So if you can imagine, this plate was moved a little bit forwards, and you can see it right here. It was thickened, it was moved forward. That's why you have 3 plates on the left up there, and that's why you only see 2 on the Ravager here. Not that big of a difference. However, the size of the head is a lot bigger on the Ravager, especially when they fire and they extend their neck upwards. And so it does require this extra armor, but unfortunately it does not help protect against headshots. Now for the Ravager in the Bloodlust mode, I'll be pathing the Ravager to the edge of this block so that we get a accurate value of the amount of blocks. On the first block here, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 blocks for the Bloodlust proc. When the Ravager screams and starts going aggro and it raises its hand to above its shoulder, we will know that it has activated. So let's activate guard number 8 and see if the Ravager does aggro. It does not. Number 7. 7 blocks of distance, 6 blocks of distance activated behind him too. I moved a little bit too far forward, and there we can see it. Block 4 and 5 did not aggro the Ravager, and block 6 did. So then we can say that Bloodlust on Ravagers work from 6 blocks away. Now looking at the base Sentry mod values, we can see right from here where it activates that actually it does extend towards map edge, which is represented by that last bit of bedrock over there in the corner, and from activation towards actually firing is about 3.5 really long seconds. Far too long for a good trap. And that it has 2 bounces, actually only 2 bounces, but it can hit 3 objects with its beam before the beam dissipates. With the first mod over Amplify, you can increase the amount of deflex that this beam can have by an additional 2 times, meaning it would hit 5 objects instead of 3. This is especially useful. That actually counted as one hit. If you're using something from the left side of the map to the right side of the map, as you can see, the beam extends and extends and extends. As long as it doesn't go outside of the map edge, you can effectively use it to have a beam go from this corner all the way to the opposite end of this building limit over here. Now, even though the beam does stop at the map limit, the beam itself does have a maximum length of 26 blocks that it can travel through. So you can use this to cross map as long as the range that you're doing this on does not exceed a total range of 26 blocks. Now, with deflects, you can actually extend how far this beam can go by having it ricochet against slants well enough so that the maximum usage of those 26 blocks is always reached. And the next mod we're going to take a look at for the Sentry beam is the tracking mod, which increases its tracking, as you can see on the one there on the right. And this is really visible, especially if you're within half a block of distance from the beam itself. Now, while we're in this beam on the left, you can see that it does kind of follow, but it is kind of slow to catch up. And something also to note is that the activation time to shoot the active beam itself is much longer on a beam than has the tracking mod. Now, see how fast that snaps towards us? It is a little bit faster than the base Sentry beam, and it activates a little bit later. So all in all, if I move really far away, it doesn't really track amazingly fast, but it does track further, and it does track more accurately, especially if you consider that tracking and firing an accurate beam is one of the better things that this trap can have. Now, staying in range and just moving left to right, we can see it does have a bit of a moderate speed, but it's pretty normal. Not much faster than this one, but it does take a little longer to fire, and it is generally more accurate. Now, for the next mod, we're going to be looking at the pinball mod for the Sentry beam that increases the maximum angle that the beams can deflect off of surfaces. Previously, we saw that it would hit this slant, hit this slant, hit this slant, hit that slant, and it would kind of deflect at roughly about a 90-degree angle. However, with the pinball mod, we can see that it no longer just deflects to the side, it deflects upwards, giving it some added value. In this case, it is much more unpredictable about where it is going to deflect towards, and I actually have no idea why it's deflecting upwards instead of towards the side. That's one of the greatest mysteries of life, I suppose. You can see there, hit this and then it deflects upwards. So generally it seems to continuously deflect upwards, unless of course the slant is pointing directly down. The left to right angle has also been increased. I think it's from a 90-degree angle that it can deflect left to right to a 120-degree angle, and a slightly conical angle that can also be deflected slightly more upwards and slightly more downwards, presumably by about 20 degrees. Now, the final mod we're going to be talking about on the Sentry beam is the burst beam, which has two positives and a negative. It increases the tracking rate, just like target lock does, and the rate of fire, but it does decrease the duration that the beam persists as an on-hit kill mechanic. So if your aim is to catch the raider quickly, instead of having a persisting beam that can perhaps kill your own guards that are moving through this beam, then the burst beam is the way to go. Generally a very good idea to mix these up with other Sentry beams that do not have burst beam in order to get a lot quicker rate of fire, and in doing so a higher accuracy rating for these beams shooting into corners or little hidey holes where players could be taking shelter from the destructive beams that gets created here. With the burst mod on the Sentry beam, the activation time towards firing is about 2.5 seconds, and as you can see, the beam lasts roughly about a third of the time that it did before. Great for catching players off guard, especially with the over amplify mod, increasing the amount of bounces and temporarily increasing the effective area that you're zoning a player out of. And that does it for the Sentry beam. On to the next! For the already existing traps though, there have been quite a few new additions in Dreadshore. For the Incinerator, it got the Firestorm mod, which increases the time that flames are expelled by 2 seconds. Cannonbacks received the Grand Sacrifice mod, which triggers a Deadman Switch timer and a Deadman Switch explosion while the Cannonback is still alive. However, unfortunately, when the Cannonback dies, this explosion is cancelled and does not go through. So unless you can keep it alive and it's in a good position, I would not recommend using it. The Iron Claw trap got self-destruct, so it explodes, and the self-destruct is pretty much the same as it is in all the other traps. Once the trap is destroyed, it explodes after a few seconds, just like the piston self-destruct. Now, the pistons also got a really great mod, the Pulverize mod, which massively increases the firing rate of the piston. Once it fires, like there's a 0.3 or 0.4 second window through which the piston retracts and slightly heats up, and then it immediately fires again. It's absolutely crazy. The coverage on this is insane, especially if you combo it with Hollow Cube. If you walk through the Hollow Cube, it breaks the Hollow Cube, the piston instantly fires. There's a lot of this being used right now. It's really, really strong and good for catching people off guard. And the instantly firing piston, if you touch these heated plates, these 5 heated plates, you instantly die. So that's pretty good. So those are all the newest mods. I'm going to have one run through them to just demonstrate how they each work. And that'll be it for all the guards and traps. Now for these, I'll just quickly give a bit of a rundown. It activates within about a block of distance, and if you kill it, it doesn't explode. The difference between the 2 incinerators, 1 to 3.5 seconds, this one stops, and then an additional 2 seconds, 5.5 seconds of flame activation if you have the mod Firestorm on that. And if I were to hit it, it triggers the self-destruct explosion, which has the exact same radius and timer as the other ones. This is the difference between a piston with Pulverize on the left and a piston with Pulverize and Unstable on the right. Unstable is supposed to work in a very good way. Take the amount of time, let's say a base piston fires once every 2 seconds, just to take an example. If you add Unstable, it should give like something like a 40% increase or decrease to that timer randomly, or 20%. I think it's not 40%, but let's use an example that has noticeable amount of time difference between the firing of the piston. 2 seconds, let's say there's a 40% difference. Now it is 1.5 seconds minimal activation, or 2.5 seconds maximum difference between the firing. So the minimum amount of time that a piston cannot fire is 1.5 seconds, and the maximum amount of time it cannot fire is 2.5 seconds. It should be somewhere between that randomly, because it says random intervals. However, as you could have seen from the piston on the left, it's supposed to fire once every 0.3 seconds after retracting. This does not. So the Unstable mod either has a really massive amount of percentage difference, which is not the case because on normal pistons it doesn't do this, or it has its own modifier. It has its own base amount of time and its own base firing rate. So don't do that. Even though putting Disruptor on it makes it extend and retract faster and it has less time to heat up, the actual time in between the piston firing is still massive. I do not recommend using these two together. They are counterproductive. Don't do it. Now, with the newest update, we also received a suit, the Nautilus suit, which has a codex entry that explains a bit about the lore of it, as well as for its weapon, have a bit of lore around that too that you can read within your own time, or pause the video now if you want to. With that, the Nautilus also received 3 mods that you can swap onto other suits if you've mastered the slots that were initially within that suit. For the Kamitachi, if you had bought all 3 of them and got them to level 4, which is the blue level here you can see, then you're able to swap them for other traits that are also level 4. And in doing so, you can mix and match all of these wonderful biolinks to create a massively catered suit that is extremely overpowered. Now, the 3 mods that Nautilus came with were Countercharge, which increases the effect following a perfect block. In the case of the Arc Barrier, as when you do a perfect block, this increases the amount of time that the Arc Barrier is active by a significant amount of time. Now, there is no direct number here, but it is about a second to 1.5 seconds, depending on if you hit a perfect block. For the Surge Override, this decreases the recharge time of a defensive weapon by 40%. Now, you can think this in combination with Countercharge is pretty strong, especially on Arc Barrier. You will have a roughly 35 to 45% increase in the amount of active time that the Arc Barrier is active, and you will have a 40% recharge. So the gaps in between the invulnerability window that Arc Barrier provides are going to be reduced by more than half. It is absolutely insane how much value Countercharge and Surge Override provide towards custodians, especially for keeping themselves alive. And it's complete immunity to all types of damage. You can use this to fall like through, I think, 10 plus corrosives at just normal speed, and it is more than useful enough when facing your average everyday outpost. The only thing that could counter this is a rapid onslaught and a lot of traps, a lot of trap density, but that's where the Demolition Cannon comes in mind. The third biolink is the Block Lock, which increases the time to perform a perfect block by 0.5 seconds. Now, the Arc Barrier got nerfed. It had this biolink as a base mod on the base value that a perfect block could be done with. Now, they reduced the time to have a perfect block on the Arc Barrier to make it more difficult to use it without this mod, and make it more difficult to use the shield in general. But by doing this, you know, you can go back to the good old days when you can just right click and be invulnerable for 50 years and have no problems just waltzing your way right onto the gen mat and waltzing your way right out, provided you didn't die during the downtime. So for the 2 upgrades for the Demolition Cannon, as you can see here under features, the ammo capacity is increased by 1 on the first upgrade, and the blast radius is increased by 1 meter on the second one. Now, the blast radius is 4 meters. This is the radius, so this extends 4.05 meters in every single direction. It does crushing damage, which destroys any flesh, any armor, and any traps. And because it is an AoE, it instant kills guards through their armor, regardless of where the actual projectile hits the guard or if it hits the wall next to it. The bombs that the Demolition Cannon shoots activate the moment you shoot at the floor. So as you can see here, I'm shooting it, it's not activating or exploding, but the moment it hits the floor, it explodes 1 second after hitting the floor. There is a bit of gravity, so if you're going to shoot it and it bounces off, it doesn't normally go very far downwards, just about a quarter of a block, depending on how far you shoot it. But the radius, as you can see, is quite massive. And this is very, very, very useful, especially when dealing with a lot of highly dense traps, especially in anti-speedrun setups that has an incinerator in the back corner and 4 pistons leading up to it. Now you can also snipe with this if you want and kill multiple traps and multiple guards at the same time. Behavior have put multiple videos out of this where you can see it, and the arc that you can fire the gun is pretty lenient. I'm gonna fire it from here and we'll see how far it can reach. Just if I fire it directly forward 90 degrees. So there we go, 90 degrees. How far does it reach? Quite a considerable distance of about 8 blocks far. This is the range that the Ravager activates at, and the range that its bullets disappear. And the fact that you have this amount of power, this amount of radius, look at that, look how big that is. That's like 1.5 blocks range towards every side. See, yeah, it is about 1 to 1.5 blocks of range. The explosion actually, yeah, just slightly more than a block. So the explosion itself reaches about 1.25 to 1.5 blocks around it, that it destroys absolutely everything. And this is used at its best when you have a bunch of traps in a wall and you fire it towards the side and it bounces and it detonates while it's still mid-air, making full advantage of the circular radius that the explosion happens with for around it. One last thing that I forgot to mention is that there were ranked decals that got released, and they look absolutely fantastic. We have the bronze and the silver from left to right, bronze, silver, gold, and masters. The only thing I'd really say I don't like about them is how normally bright the reflections are on them, and that the masters one looks a lot like the bronze and the silver one. It's not as distinguishable as you would imagine it to be, but it does still look pretty damn good. And these are for Season 0 that came in the Dreadshore sector update, but there will be more that release when the next sector comes, which will be very soon. I do believe it is the 26th of September, and there's a devs live stream, I think on the 21st or the 22nd of September, where they're going to be explaining the new quest system in the game, Expeditions, and how that's going to work and what that's going to entail. Feel free to check them out on their YouTube as well as their Twitch. Join the Meet Your Maker community Discord for regular updates on the Meet Your Maker Twitter, as well as when this live stream is going to be happening. But thank you so much, everybody, for watching. I hope you learned something interesting. Get in the comments, get in your outposts, make some amazing combos with these things. There are some things you can only do with knowledge, exact knowledge of where certain limits are and what you can do with them. Please feel free to share them. I would love to raid them, I would love to run them, and I hope you guys are as hype as I am for the next sector dropping. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. I've been your host, and you've been absolutely amazing. Take care.